The letter fell from Eleanor Ashworth's hand and landed face down on the cold stone floor of the hallway. She did not need to read it again. She had already read it 3 times, and each time the words had stung more than the last. Her name had been removed from the guest list of the county ball. Not forgotten, removed. Someone had taken a pen and drawn a careful line through it, and Eleanor knew exactly whose handwriting that was. She bent down, picked up the letter, and folded it slowly before slipping it into the pocket of her dress. From the drawing room, she could hear her younger sisters laughing. Lydia's voice was sharp and bright, the kind of laugh that filled a room and pushed everyone else into the corners. Charlotte's laugh followed a second later, always a step behind, always trying to match her sister's confidence. Eleanor stood outside the door for a moment, gathering herself, before she pushed it open and stepped inside.
"There she is,"
Lydia said, not even turning her head.
"the spinster of Ashworth House."
Charlotte giggled into her teacup, 28 years old and still no husband. "Mother says it is becoming an embarrassment to the family." Eleanor said nothing. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where the late afternoon light was falling gently across the hedges. She had learned, over many years, that silence was often the strongest answer she could give. "You should stay home from the ball this year," Lydia continued, setting down her cup with a small, satisfied click. "It would spare everyone the trouble of explaining who you are to the guests." "I was not aware I needed an explanation," Eleanor said quietly. "Oh, but you do," Charlotte said. "An unmarried woman of your age, standing among all the young ladies. People will think something is wrong with you." Eleanor turned from the window and looked at her sisters. Lydia was 22, golden-haired, and used to being admired. Charlotte was 20, a shadow of Lydia in almost every way, content to walk in her sister's light rather than seek her own. Eleanor had watched them grow from small children into young women who had somehow learned to see her as an obstacle rather than a sister. "I have already seen the guest list," Eleanor said. "My name has been removed." For a moment, neither sister spoke. Then Lydia's mouth curved into a small smile. "Mother thought it was for the best. There is no reason for you to attend a ball meant for finding husbands. You are long past that stage of life." "I am 8 years older than you," Eleanor said, "not 80. "It might as well be the same thing," Lydia replied, and Charlotte laughed again, a little too loudly. The door opened, and Lady Priscilla Ashworth entered the room, her silk skirts rustling against the floor. She was a tall woman, with sharp features and an even sharper way of looking at people, as though she were always calculating something behind her eyes. When she saw Eleanor standing by the window, her expression tightened. "Eleanor," she said, "I see you have found the letter." "I have, Mother." "Then you understand my reasoning. The ball is an important event this year. Every family in the county will be watching to see whose daughters attract the finest attention. I cannot have you standing at the edge of the room, drawing unwanted comparisons." "Comparisons to what exactly?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice steady. "To your sisters," Lady Priscilla said simply, as though the answer should have been obvious. "They are young and full of promise. You are settled." There is no unkindness in stating a fact. There was, of course, a great deal of unkindness in it, but Eleanor had long since stopped expecting her mother to notice the difference. "I understand," Eleanor said, and she meant it. She understood perfectly well. She always had. She left the drawing room without another word, and walked down the long hallway toward the study, where her father, Lord Edmund Ashworth, spent most of his days buried in papers and ledgers he barely understood. The truth, which no one in the family liked to speak aloud, was that the Ashworth estate had been slipping toward trouble for years, and it was Eleanor, not her father, who had quietly kept it from collapsing. She sat down at the desk, pulled open the drawer where the household accounts were kept, and began to work through the numbers with the same steady focus she brought to everything. It was tedious work, checking figures against receipts, finding the small errors that, left alone, would have grown into large ones. No one thanked her for it. No one even knew she did it, except her father, who signed whatever she placed in front of him without asking questions. As she worked, she thought about the ball, and about the years that had passed since she was first introduced to society. She remembered being 17, hopeful and eager, standing at her first dance and waiting for someone to ask her name. No one had. She was not unattractive, but she had never possessed the easy sparkle that drew men across a crowded room the way Lydia's did now. Eleanor's strength was quieter. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed things other people missed. It was not a quality that men of fashion tended to admire, at least not at first glance. Over the years, the whispers had grown louder, too plain, too serious, too old now to bother with. She had heard them all, spoken just loudly enough for her to catch, never quite loud enough to answer without seeming foolish. She had learned to walk through rooms as though the words could not touch her, even when they did. A knock came at the study door, and her father's steward, a quiet older man named Mr. Foley, stepped inside. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "a rider has come from town with news. It seems the whole county is talking of it." "What news?" Eleanor asked, setting down her pen. "Duke Alistair Renfield has confirmed his attendance at the county ball," Mr. Foley said. "It is the first time he has appeared at any gathering in nearly 3 years." Eleanor sat back in her chair. Even she, who paid little attention to society gossip, knew the name. Duke Renfield was spoken of in careful, lowered voices, the way people spoke of storms that might return without warning. He was young for a duke, not yet 40, and immensely wealthy, but it was not his wealth that people whispered about. It was the story of his first engagement, years ago, to a young woman named Miss Vaughan, who had died suddenly and mysteriously not long before their wedding. No one had ever proven anything against him, but the rumors had followed him ever since, and he had withdrawn from society almost entirely, living alone at his estate, with only his staff for company. Why would he choose to attend now? Eleanor asked, more to herself than to Mr. Foley. "No one seems to know, miss, but I imagine your mother will be rearranging her plans within the hour." He was right. By the time Eleanor returned to the drawing room, the household had already transformed into something close to chaos. Lady Priscilla was pacing back and forth, listing names of seamstresses who needed to be summoned at once. Lydia and Charlotte were arguing over who would wear the blue silk and who would wear the green, both certain that their chosen color would catch the Duke's eye first. "A duke," Lydia said breathlessly, clutching her sister's arm. "Charlotte, imagine it. If he were to notice me, we would never have to worry about anything again." "He notices no one," Charlotte said. "That is what makes him so interesting. Perhaps this year will be different." Lady Priscilla turned to Eleanor, and for a brief moment, something calculating flickered across her face, as though she were weighing whether Eleanor's presence at the ball might somehow be useful after all. But the moment passed quickly. "You will stay home, Eleanor," she said firmly. "There is no reason to complicate matters further. This is your sister's opportunity, not yours." Eleanor did not argue. She simply nodded and left the room again, walking out into the garden where the evening air was cool and quiet. She sat on the old stone bench beneath the apple tree, the same bench where she had sat as a girl, long before she understood how small a place the world had decided to give her. She thought of the Duke, a man everyone feared and no one truly knew, and wondered, for just a moment, what it might feel like to be seen the way he seemed to see nothing at all. Then she pushed the thought away, because wondering about such things had never once done her any good. Above her, the first stars were beginning to appear, and somewhere in the house behind her, her sisters were still arguing over silk and color, utterly certain that the coming ball belonged entirely to them. Eleanor closed her eyes and let the quiet of the garden settle over her, unaware that in a matter of days, everything her family believed about her place in the world was about to be proven wrong. The following morning, the Ashworth household was already loud with activity before the sun had fully risen. Seamstresses arrived in a small procession of carriages, carrying bolts of fabric in every shade Lady Priscilla had requested. Lydia stood in the middle of the drawing room, arms outstretched, while a woman with a mouth full of pins measured her waist for the 3rd time. Charlotte sat nearby, sulking because the seamstress had suggested her chosen shade of green did not suit her complexion. Eleanor moved quietly through the edges of this storm, carrying ledgers to her father's study, checking on the kitchen staff who had been given no instructions despite the sudden need to prepare refreshments for visiting dressmakers, and generally holding the household together while everyone else focused on ribbons and lace. No one asked for her help. No one needed to. She simply gave it, the way she always did. It was late in the afternoon when Helen Whitfield arrived. Helen was one of the few people in the county Eleanor considered a true friend, a warm and clever woman, a few years younger than Eleanor, married to a modest gentleman farmer, and entirely unconcerned with the games of society that consumed so many other households. She found Eleanor in the small library at the back of the house, sorting through a stack of correspondence that had been ignored for days. "I heard the news," Helen said, settling into the chair across from Eleanor's desk. "The whole county has heard the news. Duke Renfield, attending a ball. I did not think I would live to see the day." "My mother has already reorganized the entire household because of it," Eleanor said, not looking up from her papers. "And what of you? Are you as excited as your sisters?" Eleanor finally looked up, and something in her expression made Helen sit forward. "I am not attending," Eleanor said. "My name has been removed from the guest list." Helen's mouth fell open. "Removed? By whom?" "By my mother, I believe. Though I suppose it does not matter who held the pen." "Eleanor, that is absurd. You are the eldest daughter of this house. You have every right to attend." "My mother believes my presence would draw unwanted comparisons," Eleanor said, repeating the words as though they belonged to someone else entirely, someone she had read about in a book rather than lived through herself. Helen shook her head slowly, her expression caught somewhere between anger and disbelief. "I have known your mother for many years, and I have never understood how a woman so concerned with appearances could treat her own daughter this way. Does your father know?" "My father signs whatever is placed in front of him," Eleanor said. "He will not interfere." Helen was quiet for a moment, tapping her fingers against the arm of the chair. Then she reached into the small bag she carried and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I came here for another reason as well," she said. "This arrived at my house yesterday, addressed to you. I believe it was sent to the wrong estate by mistake, since our families live so close together." Eleanor took the letter and turned it over. It bore an official seal, one she did not immediately recognize. Stamped in dark wax at the fold, she broke it open carefully and read the contents twice before she trusted herself to speak. "It is a formal invitation," she said slowly, "to the county ball, addressed directly to me." "Then someone did intend for you to attend," Helen said. "Your name was not simply left off by accident. Someone crossed it out on purpose, and yet here is a separate invitation, sent in your name." Eleanor stared at the paper in her hands, her mind working quickly. "The organizing committee must have sent invitations to every eligible young woman in the county independently, before my mother had the chance to arrange the household guest list herself. This one must have been delayed somewhere along its journey." "Which means," Helen said, a small smile beginning to form, "you have every right to attend, regardless of what your mother has decided. You were invited by the ball's own organizers, not by your family." For the first time in days, something like hope stirred in Eleanor's chest, quiet and cautious, the way a small flame catches before it dares to grow larger. She folded the invitation carefully and held it against her lap. "If I attend, my mother will be furious." "Your mother is already treating you unfairly," Helen said gently. "I do not say this to be unkind, Eleanor, but you have spent years making yourself smaller, so that the rest of your family could feel larger. Perhaps it is time to stop." Eleanor did not answer right away. She thought of the years of quiet comments, the small cruelties dressed up as jokes, the way her own mother's eyes passed over her as though she were a piece of furniture that had simply always been there. She thought of the countless evenings she had sat alone while her sisters danced, telling herself it did not matter, that she did not need what they had. "I will think on it," she said finally, though something in her voice suggested the decision had already been made. That evening, at dinner, the topic of the ball dominated every conversation, as it had for the past 2 days. Lydia spoke endlessly about the blue silk dress the seamstress had finally agreed to finish in time, describing in detail how the color would catch the candlelight during the dancing. Charlotte complained about her sister receiving the better fabric, and Lady Priscilla, seated at the head of the table in her husband's usual place since he preferred to eat separately in his study, oversaw the conversation like a general reviewing troops before battle. "Everything must be perfect," she said, cutting her meat with precise, deliberate movements. "The Duke has not attended a single gathering in 3 years. If either of you can secure even a moment of his attention, it could change the fortunes of this entire family." "Do you truly believe he might notice one of us?" Charlotte asked. "I believe," Lady Priscilla said, "that a man who has avoided society for so long will be starved for something new to look at. And what is newer than two young women who have never had the opportunity to be seen by him before? Eleanor sat quietly at the far end of the table, listening to her mother's calculations, as though they were discussing livestock rather than her own daughters. She thought of the invitation, folded carefully inside the drawer of her writing desk upstairs, and she said nothing at all. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Eleanor lay awake staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, turning the decision over in her mind again and again. She thought of Helen's words, of the years she had spent shrinking herself to avoid conflict, of the countless times she had told herself that peace was worth more than pride. She thought, too, of the strange and unexpected invitation that had found its way into her hands almost by accident, as though fate itself had decided to intervene where her family would not. She rose from her bed, lit a small candle, and walked to her writing desk. She opened the drawer and took out the invitation again, running her fingers over the raised wax seal. Whatever waited for her at that ball, whatever judgment or mockery her family might offer afterward, she found that she no longer feared it the way she once had. The next morning, she informed her mother calmly, over breakfast, that she would be attending the ball after all. Lady Priscilla's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I believe I made my wishes on this matter quite clear." "You did," Eleanor said. "But I have received a formal invitation directly from the organizing committee, addressed to me by name. I believe it would reflect poorly on this family if I were to decline an invitation that was never yours to give or take away." Lydia set down her teacup with a sharp clatter. "This is ridiculous." "She only wishes to embarrass us." "I wish for nothing of the kind," Eleanor said calmly. "I simply wish to attend a ball, as any unmarried woman of this family might reasonably do." Lady Priscilla studied her eldest daughter for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes. Perhaps she recognized, for the first time in years, that the quiet daughter she had so easily dismissed was not quite as easy to dismiss as she had assumed. "Very well," she said finally, her voice clipped and cold. "Attend if you must. But do not expect any assistance in preparing yourself. You will need to manage your own dress and your own arrangements." "I would expect nothing less," Eleanor replied, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something close to steady ground beneath her feet. She spent the following days quietly preparing on her own, altering an older gown she had kept from years before, simple in design but well made, a soft gray fabric that suited her far better than the bright, competing colors her sisters had chosen. She did not need to outshine anyone. She only needed to arrive, to stand in the room as herself, and to stop apologizing for a place in the world she had every right to occupy. On the morning of the ball, as the household buzzed with last-minute preparations, Eleanor stood before her mirror and looked at her reflection for a long moment. She saw a woman of 28 years, calm and composed, with tired eyes that had learned to carry more than their share of quiet disappointment. But she also saw, for the first time in a long while, someone who was no longer waiting for permission to exist. Outside, carriages were already being prepared, and somewhere across the county, in a grand and quiet estate that had not welcomed visitors in years, Duke Alistair Renfield was making his own preparations to step back into a world he had left behind, unaware that the evening ahead would change the course of his life as much as it would change Eleanor's. The great hall of Marchfield House had been transformed for the occasion. Hundreds of candles lined the walls, their flames reflected endlessly in tall mirrors that made the room look twice its true size. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, and servants moved quietly among the growing crowd, offering trays of refreshment to guests who had traveled from every corner of the county to witness what promised to be the most talked-about event of the season. Eleanor arrived with her family in a carriage, thick with tension. Lydia fussed endlessly with her blue silk gown, checking her reflection in the small mirror set into the carriage wall. Charlotte sat beside her, arms crossed, still resentful over the matter of fabric. Lady Priscilla sat rigid and silent, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Eleanor, with an expression that suggested she had not yet forgiven her for insisting on attending. When the carriage finally stopped, and the family stepped out into the torchlit courtyard, Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always came before entering a crowded room. She reminded herself of the invitation folded safely in her small bag, of Helen's encouraging words, of the quiet decision she had made in the candlelight of her own bedroom. She lifted her chin and walked inside beside her family, rather than a step behind them, as she so often had in the past. The great hall was already filled with color and sound when they entered. Groups of young women clustered near the edges of the dance floor, watching the door with barely disguised anticipation, waiting for the moment everyone had been speaking of for days. Whispers moved through the crowd like a current beneath still water. Has he arrived yet? Not yet. They say he never comes early. They say he might not come at all. Eleanor moved through the crowd quietly, accepting a glass of refreshment from a passing servant, finding a place near one of the tall windows where she could observe the room, without being pulled into its center. She had long ago learned that watching from the edges suited her better than standing beneath its brightest lights, though tonight, for the first time, she did not feel as though she were hiding. She simply felt as though she were choosing her place. Not far from her, she noticed a young man she did not recognize, tall and well-dressed, speaking in low, urgent tones with another gentleman near the refreshment table. Something about the tightness of his posture caught her attention, the way his eyes darted toward the door every few moments, as though he were waiting for something specific to happen, rather than simply enjoying the evening. "That is Lord Henry Vale," came a voice beside her. Eleanor turned to find Helen, who had arrived separately with her husband, and was now studying the same young man with visible curiosity.
"He has been courting your sister Lydia for several weeks now, though I imagine tonight might complicate his plans considerably."
"Why would tonight complicate anything?" Eleanor asked. "Because if the Duke shows even the slightest interest in Lydia, Lord Vale's hopes of securing her dowry through marriage will vanish entirely. A Duke's interest outweighs a lord's, no matter how charming that lord believes himself to be." Eleanor watched Lord Vale for a moment longer, noting the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against his glass. She filed the observation away, without quite knowing why it seemed important. The same instinct that had helped her catch small errors in her father's accounts for years now quietly working beneath the surface of her thoughts. The evening continued, dancing began, and Eleanor watched from the edges as Lydia and Charlotte moved through the crowd with practiced grace, laughing loudly enough to be noticed, positioning themselves near the most prominent guests. Eleanor herself was asked to dance twice, by older gentlemen who seemed to regard her more as a pleasant conversationalist than anything else, and she accepted both invitations with quiet grace, grateful simply to be included rather than left standing alone. It was nearly an hour into the evening when the great doors at the far end of the hall opened, and the room fell into a hush so sudden and complete that even the musicians faltered for a moment before recovering their tune. Duke Alistair Renfield stood in the doorway. He was taller than Eleanor had expected, broad-shouldered, dressed simply but with obvious quality, his dark hair slightly too long for current fashion, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the crowded room before him. There was nothing outwardly frightening about him, and yet Eleanor understood immediately why people spoke of him the way they did. There was a stillness to him, a weight in the way he carried himself, as though he had long ago stopped caring what anyone in a room like this thought of him. The crowd parted slightly as he moved forward, and Eleanor watched as every young woman near the door seemed to straighten at once, adjusting gowns and hair with quick, nervous movements. Lydia, standing near the center of the floor, turned immediately in his direction, a bright and practiced smile already forming on her face. "Now we shall see," Helen murmured beside Eleanor, "whether the rumors about him are true." The Duke moved through the crowd with polite but distant nods, accepting greetings from the evening's host without lingering long enough for conversation. Several young women attempted to catch his attention as he passed, offering compliments about the music or the decorations, but he responded to each with only a brief word before continuing on. Lydia stepped directly into his path near the edge of the dance floor, curtsying deeply. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "What an honor it is to finally see you among us again." The Duke inclined his head politely. "Miss Ashworth, I presume." "You know my name," Lydia said, clearly delighted. "Your mother mentioned it to the host earlier this evening, quite loudly, and several times," the Duke said, his tone giving nothing away. "It would have been difficult not to know it." Lydia's smile faltered only slightly before she recovered. "I hope you will consider a dance later this evening, Your Grace. I have heard so much about you." "I imagine you have heard a great many things," the Duke said, most of them untrue. He moved past her before she could respond, leaving Lydia standing in the middle of the floor, with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and irritation. Charlotte hurried to her sister's side, whispering something Eleanor could not hear, and the two of them retreated toward the edge of the room, their earlier confidence noticeably dimmed. Eleanor remained near the window, watching the Duke move through the crowd with a kind of careful detachment, as though he had built an invisible wall between himself and everyone around him. She did not expect him to notice her. She had spent her entire life being overlooked in rooms far less crowded than this one, and she saw no reason tonight would prove different. It was, perhaps, an hour later, when a small commotion drew her attention toward the refreshment table. A servant carrying a tray of drinks had stumbled slightly, and in the confusion, a glass of dark wine had spilled directly across the front of Eleanor's gray gown. She heard laughter behind her almost immediately, sharp and unmistakable. "How clumsy of you, sister," Lydia said, appearing at her side with Charlotte close behind. "Perhaps you should have stayed home after all, rather than embarrass yourself in front of the entire county." Several nearby guests turned to look, their expressions ranging from sympathy to poorly concealed amusement. Eleanor felt heat rise to her face, the old familiar instinct to shrink and apologize rising up inside her. But she pushed it down, took a slow breath, and reached for a cloth a passing servant offered her. "Accidents happen," she said calmly, dabbing at the stain without any visible distress. "I do not believe a spilled glass of wine is quite the disaster you seem to hope it is." "Perhaps not," Lydia said, "but it certainly does nothing to help your prospects this evening." "I was not aware I had prospects to protect," Eleanor replied evenly, and something in her tone made Lydia's smile falter for just a moment before she turned and walked away, with Charlotte trailing behind her. Eleanor stood alone for a moment, the damp cloth still in her hand, when a quiet voice spoke from just behind her. "Your sister seems to enjoy an audience." Eleanor turned and found herself looking directly into the calm, unreadable eyes of Duke Alistair Renfield. For a moment, she said nothing at all, too surprised to form a response. Up close, his eyes were a deep gray, sharp and observant, studying her with an attention that felt entirely different from the polite indifference he had shown the rest of the room. "She enjoys many things at my expense," Eleanor said finally, surprising herself with her own honesty. "I have grown used to it." "That is unfortunate," the Duke said. "You handled it with more grace than most people in this room would have managed." "There is little use in making a scene over spilled wine, Your Grace." "There is little use in making a scene over most things," he replied. "And yet people rarely seem to understand that." Eleanor studied him for a moment, curious despite herself. There was none of the coldness in his manner that she had expected from the whispered stories, only a quiet, careful watchfulness, as though he were constantly weighing the words of everyone around him, against some private measure only he understood. "You did not answer your sister's request for a dance," Eleanor observed, unable to help herself. "No," he said simply, "I did not wish to." "And yet you are speaking with me instead." "I am," he agreed, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Would you object to a dance, Miss Ashworth?" The words seemed to ripple outward through the crowd almost instantly, heads turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence, as guests realized what had just been asked, and to whom. Eleanor felt the weight of dozens of eyes settle upon her, and for the first time that evening, she did not feel the urge to shrink beneath their attention. "I would not object at all," she said, and placed her hand in his. The musicians began a new piece as the Duke led her onto the floor, and the crowd parted around them in stunned silence, watching the man who had avoided society for 3 years dance with the daughter no one in the county had expected him to notice at all. Lydia stood frozen near the edge of the room, her face pale with disbelief. Lady Priscilla's teacup trembled slightly in her hand as she watched her eldest daughter move gracefully across the floor in the arms of the most sought-after man in the county. Eleanor barely noticed any of them. For the length of that single dance, the room seemed to fall away entirely, leaving only the quiet, steady presence of the man before her, and the strange, unfamiliar feeling of being truly seen for the very first time in her adult life. When the music ended, the Duke did not release her hand immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the tall glass doors that led out onto the terrace, where the night air promised a welcome escape from the heat and noise of the crowded hall. "Would you walk with me, Miss Ashworth?" he asked. "I find I have little patience left for crowded rooms tonight." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding, aware of the many eyes still fixed upon them as they crossed the floor together. The terrace was cooler and far quieter, lit only by a scattering of lanterns hung along the stone railing, the sounds of the ball fading into a soft murmur behind the closed doors. They walked in silence for a while, the gravel path crunching softly beneath their feet, before the Duke finally spoke. "You did not flatter me," he said. "When I approached you tonight, you did not ask about my estate, or my income, or offer empty compliments about my presence at the ball. I did not think you would want to hear such things," Eleanor said honestly. "You seem tired of hearing them from everyone else." He glanced at her, something like surprise flickering across his features. "Most people assume that a man in my position wishes for flattery above all else." "Perhaps," Eleanor said. "But a man who avoids society for 3 years does not strike me as someone who values empty words very highly." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, staring out over the dark garden beyond the terrace. "You are perceptive, Miss Ashworth, more perceptive than most people give you credit for, I imagine." "My family has never had much use for my perceptions," Eleanor said, a note of dry humor slipping into her voice despite herself. "They prefer my sister's talents, dancing, singing, charming conversation. I have always been better suited to numbers and quiet observation." "Those are not small talents," the Duke said. "In my experience, they are far rarer than the ones your family seems to prize." They walked further along the terrace, past a small stone bench where the lantern light did not quite reach, and the Duke slowed his steps, as though weighing something carefully in his mind before he spoke again. "You have heard the stories about me," he said. It was not a question. Eleanor considered lying, offering some polite denial, but something about the honesty he had shown her so far made the idea feel dishonest. "I have heard them," she admitted, "though I do not know how much of what I have heard is true." "Most of it is not," he said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the subject cost him something to discuss. "I was engaged once, many years ago, to a woman named Miss Vaughn. She died suddenly, only weeks before our wedding. The circumstances were never fully explained, and in the absence of answers, people invented their own." "I am sorry," Eleanor said quietly. "That must have been a terrible loss." "It was," he said simply. "But the loss was made worse by the whispers that followed. Some believed I had caused her death somehow, through neglect or cruelty, though no evidence of either was ever found. Others believed I had driven her to despair through some unspoken fault of my character. I withdrew from society because I found it easier to be alone than to be watched so closely by people searching for a villain in my grief." Eleanor listened, without interrupting, understanding, perhaps better than most, what it felt like to be judged by people who had never taken the time to truly know her. "I do not believe the stories," she said finally, "not because I know anything about what happened, but because a man who has spent 3 years in quiet mourning does not strike me as someone capable of the cruelty people accuse him of." The Duke turned to look at her fully then, his gray eyes searching her face as though trying to determine whether her words were sincere. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because something in his shoulders eased, a tension she had not noticed until it began to fade. "There is something else," he said after a moment, "something I have not spoken of publicly, and I would ask that you keep it between us for now. You do not owe me any confidences, Your Grace." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I find myself wanting to share this one regardless." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "In recent weeks, I have received several letters, unsigned, suggesting that someone intends to revive the old rumors about Miss Vaughn's death, publicly and deliberately, in order to damage my reputation further. I do not yet know who is responsible, or why they have chosen this particular moment to act." Eleanor frowned, turning the information over in her mind. "Why would anyone wish to harm you now, after so many years of silence?" "I do not know," the Duke admitted, "though I suspect it has something to do with my decision to re-enter society. Perhaps someone fears what my return might mean for their own interests." Eleanor thought immediately of Lord Henry Vale, the tension she had noticed in him earlier that evening, the way his eyes had tracked the door as though waiting for something specific to occur. She considered mentioning it, but something held her back, an instinct that told her the observation needed more certainty before she voiced it aloud. "I hope you find whoever is responsible," she said instead, No one deserves to have old grief used against them for someone else's advantage. Thank you, the Duke said, and for the first time that evening, something in his expression softened into what might almost have been warmth. You are the first person in a very long time who has listened to my history without either pitying me or fearing me. I see no reason to do either, Eleanor said simply. You have shown me nothing tonight but honesty. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the distant music from the ball drifting faintly through the closed doors behind them. Eventually, the Duke offered his arm, and they returned inside together, drawing another wave of whispers and glances as they crossed back into the crowded hall. Lady Priscilla intercepted them almost immediately, her expression a careful mask of delight that did not quite reach her eyes. Your Grace, she said, curtsying deeply, I do hope my eldest daughter has been suitable company this evening. She has been excellent company, the Duke said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hope to have the pleasure of her conversation again soon. Lady Priscilla's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly enough to offer a gracious response. Eleanor caught Lydia's expression over her mother's shoulder, a mixture of disbelief and simmering resentment that promised trouble in the days ahead. But for the remainder of the evening, Eleanor found she could not bring herself to worry about it. The carriage ride home was tense and silent, the earlier laughter and excitement of the family replaced by a heavy, uncomfortable quiet. Lydia stared out the window with her arms crossed, refusing to speak. Charlotte glanced repeatedly at Eleanor, as though trying to understand how the evening had unfolded so differently than anyone had expected. Lady Priscilla sat rigid and silent, her mind clearly working through calculations Eleanor could only guess at. It was only when they arrived home, and the sisters had retreated upstairs, that Lady Priscilla finally spoke, catching Eleanor's arm gently as she moved toward the staircase. You will tell me everything he said to you, she said, her voice low and urgent. Every word. I will tell you what I believe is appropriate to share, Eleanor said carefully. The rest, I believe, is my own to keep. Her mother studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her sharp eyes, some old certainty about her eldest daughter beginning, perhaps for the first time, to crack. This changes nothing between us, Lady Priscilla said finally, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. You are still my daughter, and I will still expect you to act in the best interests of this family. I have always acted in the best interests of this family, Eleanor said quietly, whether anyone noticed or not. She climbed the stairs to her room alone, closed the door behind her, and sat by the window for a long while, replaying the evening in her mind. She thought of the Duke's quiet honesty, the strange comfort of being truly listened to, and the unsettling mystery of the letters he had described. Somewhere in the county, she suspected, someone was already plotting their next move, and she found herself wondering, with a small and unfamiliar flicker of determination, whether she might have some part yet to play in whatever came next. News of the dance traveled through the county faster than Eleanor could have imagined. By the following afternoon, visitors began arriving at Ashworth House in a steady stream, each one eager to confirm the rumors for themselves, and to gather whatever fresh details they could carry back to their own drawing rooms. Lady Priscilla, forced into the strange position of hosting guests who had come to discuss a triumph she had never wanted, greeted each visitor with a tight smile that did nothing to hide her discomfort. Eleanor spent most of the day quietly avoiding the drawing room altogether, retreating instead to her father's study, where the familiar comfort of numbers and ledgers offered a welcome distance from the whispers filling the rest of the house. It was there that Lydia finally found her, slamming the study door shut behind her with more force than necessary. You have ruined everything, Lydia said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. Do you understand that? Everything I have worked toward this season, gone, because you decided to make a spectacle of yourself at that ball. I did not make a spectacle of myself, Eleanor said calmly, setting down her pen. The Duke chose to speak with me. I did nothing to seek his attention. That is not what people are saying, Lydia snapped. They are saying you schemed for weeks to secure an invitation behind Mother's back, that you deliberately positioned yourself to catch his eye, that you have been planning this since the moment you learned he would attend. Eleanor felt a flicker of surprise, quickly followed by something colder and more focused. Who is saying such things? Everyone, Lydia said. It does not matter who started it. It is already spreading through the entire county. It matters a great deal who started it, Eleanor said, standing from her chair. Because none of what you have described is true, Lydia. I did not scheme for an invitation. I did not position myself for anything. If someone is spreading such a story, they are doing so deliberately, and I would very much like to know why." Lydia's expression flickered, something uncertain passing behind her eyes, before her anger reasserted itself. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before embarrassing this family." "I embarrassed no one," Eleanor said. "I attended a ball to which I was properly invited, and a gentleman chose to speak with me. If that has caused you difficulty with Lord Vale, I am sorry for it. But it is not a difficulty of my making." At the mention of Lord Vale's name, something shifted in Lydia's face, a flash of alarm quickly masked by irritation. "What does Lord Vale have to do with any of this?" "I only wondered," Eleanor said carefully, watching her sister's reaction, "whether his interest in you might have cooled somewhat, now that a duke has entered the picture." "His interest in me has nothing to do with dukes or dances," Lydia said quickly, too quickly, and turned to leave the room without another word. Eleanor stood alone for a long moment after her sister had gone, turning the conversation over in her mind. Lydia's reaction to Lord Vale's name had been sharp and immediate, far more defensive than the topic seemed to warrant on its own. Combined with the tension Eleanor had noticed in him at the ball, and the sudden appearance of a damaging rumor about her own supposed scheming, a pattern was beginning to take shape in her mind, though she did not yet have enough evidence to be certain of it. Over the following days, the rumors continued to spread and grow more elaborate with each retelling. By the end of the week, Eleanor heard whispered versions of the story, suggesting she had written to the Duke privately before the ball, that she had bribed a servant to seat her near him, that she had even hinted to acquaintances beforehand that she expected to secure his attention that very evening. None of it was true, but the fabrication was detailed enough, and consistent enough, across different tellings, that Eleanor began to suspect it had originated from a single, deliberate source, rather than the natural drift of careless gossip. Lady Priscilla, for her part, seemed torn between fury at the embarrassment the rumors caused, and a grudging awareness that her daughter's sudden prominence might yet prove useful. She alternated between cold silence and pointed questions about whether the Duke had mentioned any intention of calling on the family again, unable to fully commit to either outrage or opportunism. "You must write to him," she said, one evening, cornering Eleanor in the hallway outside her bedroom. "Thank him for the dance, perhaps. Encourage further acquaintance. It would be improper for me to write to him first, and I have no wish to appear as though I am scheming for his attention, particularly given the rumors already circulating." "Those rumors would not exist at all if you had simply stayed home." "As I asked," Lady Priscilla said sharply. "Those rumors exist because someone chose to invent them," Eleanor replied, her patience thinning. "I would think you might be more concerned with discovering who is spreading lies about your own daughter than with blaming me for the consequences of someone else's dishonesty." Lady Priscilla had no answer for that, and she retreated to her own room without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the hallway, more certain than ever that something deliberate was unfolding beneath the surface of ordinary gossip. It was Helen who finally brought her the piece of information that changed everything. She arrived at Ashworth House nearly a week after the ball, her expression grave as she settled into the chair across from Eleanor in the small library. "I have learned something troubling," Helen said without preamble. "My husband does business with a merchant in town who also supplies goods to Lord Vale's household. According to this merchant, Lord Vale has fallen into significant debt over the past year, debts he has kept carefully hidden from society. He had been counting on marrying into Lydia's dowry to settle his affairs before his creditors grew impatient." Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her, and if Lydia's prospects are damaged by association with a scandal, Lord Vale's own reputation would suffer as well, should he continue the courtship. "Precisely," Helen said, "but there is more. The merchant mentioned that Lord Vale has been seen speaking privately with a young footman who was recently dismissed from your household, a man named Barrett, who left under circumstances no one fully explained at the time." Eleanor remembered the footman in question, a sullen young man who had been let go several months earlier after a disagreement with the housekeeper over missing wine from the cellar. "You believe Lord Vale paid this footman to spread rumors about me?" "I believe it is possible," Helen said carefully, "though I have no proof beyond the merchant's observation. If the rumors about your supposed scheming took hold and society turned against you, it might have created exactly enough doubt to discourage the Duke's interest, protecting Lord Vale's plans with Lydia in the process." A scandal touching your family reflects on your sisters as well, whether it began with you or not. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind working quickly through the implications. If Helen's theory was correct, then the damaging rumors were not simply the product of idle gossip, but a deliberate scheme, calculated and cruel, designed to protect one man's financial interests, at the cost of Eleanor's reputation, and, potentially, the Duke's peace of mind as well. She thought of the letters the Duke had mentioned on the terrace, the unsigned threats suggesting someone intended to revive the old rumors about Miss Vaughan's death. Could the same person be responsible for both schemes? It seemed almost too convenient a connection to dismiss, and yet she could not immediately see how threatening the Duke's reputation would serve Lord Vale's interests in the same way that damaging Eleanor's did. "I need to speak with the Duke," Eleanor said finally. "He should know what we have learned, even if it is only suspicion rather than proof." "Be careful, Eleanor," Helen said gently. "If Lord Vale is indeed behind this, and he learns that you are investigating him, he may grow more desperate rather than less. A man with debts and a damaged reputation to protect can behave in ways that are difficult to predict." Eleanor nodded, understanding the caution, even as her resolve hardened rather than wavered. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, dismissed as too quiet, too plain, too unremarkable to matter. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had no intention of remaining quiet, now that something worth fighting for had finally presented itself. That evening, she composed a careful letter to Duke Renfield, choosing her words with deliberate precision. She did not accuse anyone directly, aware that suspicion without proof could cause as much harm as the rumors themselves. Instead, she described what she had observed at the ball, the tension in Lord Vale's manner, his connection to a dismissed footman, and the timing of the rumors that had begun circulating about her own supposed scheming. She asked only that the Duke consider the information carefully, and offered to share anything further she might learn. She sealed the letter and arranged for it to be delivered discreetly, through Mr. Foley, trusting the old steward's quiet loyalty more than any messenger her mother might have chosen. As she watched the letter disappear into the evening darkness, carried away toward Marchfield House, she felt a strange mixture of fear and determination settle over her, the same feeling, perhaps, that came to anyone who had finally decided to stop hiding from a fight that had been building around them for far longer than they realized. 3 days passed without any response, 3 days in which the rumors continued to spread and Lady Priscilla's patience continued to fray, until finally, on a quiet afternoon while Eleanor sat once again in her father's study, Mr. Foley appeared in the doorway with an expression she had not seen on him before, something close to alarm. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "a carriage has arrived. It bears the Duke's crest, and I believe he wishes to speak with you directly, and rather urgently." Eleanor rose from her chair, her heart beating faster than she cared to admit, and went to meet whatever news awaited her, uncertain whether it would bring answers, further danger, or both at once. The Duke stood in the entrance hall when she arrived, still dressed in his riding coat, as though he had come directly from his estate without pausing to change. His expression was serious, none of the careful reserve she had seen at the ball present in his features now. "Miss Ashworth," he said, bowing briefly, "forgive the intrusion. I would not have come without warning if the matter were not urgent." "Your Grace," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the small sitting room off the main hall, aware of curious servants lingering within earshot. "Please, this way." Once the door was closed behind them, the Duke wasted no time. "Your letter arrived at a fortunate moment," he said. "Yesterday evening, another unsigned letter reached my estate, far more detailed than the previous ones. It named a specific date, only 3 days from now, on which the sender claims they intend to publish a full account accusing me of causing Miss Vaughan's death, complete with fabricated testimony from servants who no longer work in my household." 3 days, Eleanor repeated. "That is very soon." "It is," the Duke agreed. "And it is not the only trouble I have discovered. My steward, following your information about the dismissed footman, made some inquiries of his own. He confirmed that a man matching Barrett's description has been seen meeting privately with Lord Vale on at least 3 occasions in the past fortnight, always in the evening, always at the same tavern outside town." Eleanor felt a chill move through her. "Then it is likely the same person behind both schemes, ruining my reputation to protect his courtship with Lydia, and now attacking you directly. Perhaps because your growing attention toward me threatens his plans even further. That would explain a great deal, the Duke said grimly. If society believes you tainted by scandal, and I am simultaneously dragged back into old rumors of a far worse nature, any connection between us becomes far less likely to survive public scrutiny. Lord Vale's path to Lydia's dowry would remain clear. We must find proof, Eleanor said, her mind already working through the problem with the same steady focus she brought to her father's tangled accounts. Suspicion alone will convince no one, and if the letter is published in 3 days, the damage may already be done before anyone can be persuaded otherwise. The Duke nodded, pacing a few steps across the small room, his expression tight with barely contained frustration. My steward believes Barrett may still be in possession of the fabricated testimony, or at least early drafts of it, since such documents are rarely composed and destroyed in a single evening. If we could recover physical evidence linking Barrett's handwriting to the letters and connect his payments to Lord Vale, we would have something far more solid than rumor to present. The tavern where they have been meeting, Eleanor said. Would Barrett still be seen there? According to my steward's inquiries, yes. He has been staying in rooms above the tavern since his dismissal from your household, likely paid for through Lord Vale's coin. Eleanor felt a surge of something unfamiliar and electric move through her, a mixture of fear and determination she had rarely experienced in her carefully ordered life. Then we must go there ourselves, tonight, before he has any warning that his scheme has been discovered. That would be dangerous, Miss Ashworth, the Duke said, turning to face her fully, concern evident in his expression. If Barrett realizes we suspect him, he may destroy the evidence entirely, or worse, warn Lord Vale before we have any chance to gather proof. Then we must be careful, not absent, Eleanor said firmly. I cannot simply wait in this house for 3 days, while my reputation, and yours, are destroyed by a man protecting nothing more than his own debts. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, an admiration that had clearly been growing since the night of the ball settling more firmly into place. Very well, he said finally. But you will not go alone. I will accompany you, along with my steward, who has some skill in matters requiring discretion. We will need a plan that does not alert Barrett to our purpose until it is too late for him to act against us. They spent the next hour devising their approach, the Duke's steward, a quiet and capable man named Mr. Ellery, joining them to finalize the details. Eleanor would enter the tavern first, posing as a traveler seeking a room, giving her the opportunity to observe Barrett's habits and confirm his presence without raising suspicion. The Duke and Mr. Ellery would follow separately, positioning themselves to intervene should anything go wrong. That evening, dressed in a plain traveling cloak borrowed from Helen, who had been brought quickly into their confidence and had agreed to accompany Eleanor for propriety's sake, Eleanor arrived at the small, dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of town. The building smelled of smoke and ale, its low ceilings and crowded tables filled with travelers and local laborers, who paid her little attention as she made her way toward the innkeeper's counter. A room for the night, if one is available, Eleanor said, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. The innkeeper, a heavy-set man with tired eyes, gestured vaguely toward the stairs. Last room on the left is free. The one beside it is occupied, so mind the noise. Eleanor's pulse quickened at the mention of the occupied room, certain it belonged to Barrett. She thanked the innkeeper and climbed the narrow stairs with Helen close behind her, both women moving as casually as their nerves would allow. As they reached the top of the stairs, a door opened further down the hallway, and Barrett himself stepped out, pulling on his coat as though preparing to leave for the evening. He glanced toward them briefly, his eyes narrowing with faint recognition, before Eleanor turned her face away, pulling the hood of her borrowed cloak slightly forward. Barrett hesitated only a moment before continuing down the stairs, his footsteps heavy and unhurried, and Eleanor released a breath she had not realized she was holding. He is leaving, Helen whispered. This may be our only opportunity. Eleanor moved quickly to the door Barrett had just vacated, testing the handle and finding it, to her relief, unlocked. Inside, the small room was cluttered with the disorganized belongings of a man who had clearly not expected anyone to search through them. Eleanor moved carefully but quickly, aware that Barrett could return at any moment. On a small writing desk near the window, she found a stack of papers, some blank, others covered in cramped, uneven handwriting. She lifted the top few sheets and felt her breath catch. The handwriting matched unmistakably the unsigned letters the Duke had described, filled with fabricated accusations against him, portions crossed out and rewritten as though the author had struggled to make the lies sound convincing. Beneath the papers, she found something even more damning: a small ledger recording payments received, dates and amounts noted in Barrett's own hand, with the initials HV written beside each entry. "This is exactly what we need," Eleanor whispered, gathering the papers carefully. A sound on the stairs made both women freeze, footsteps heavier and faster than before, climbing quickly toward the room where they stood. "Someone is coming," Helen said, her voice tight with alarm. Eleanor stuffed the papers into the inside pocket of her cloak just as the door swung open, and Barrett stood in the frame, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to fury as he recognized her. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What are you doing in my room?" "I believe you know exactly why I am here," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the fear coursing through her. Barrett's eyes flicked toward the writing desk, and whatever he saw there, or did not see, seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. He moved quickly to block the doorway, his large frame filling the narrow space entirely. "Give me those papers," he said, "and perhaps I will let you leave quietly." "I do not believe that is a promise you intend to keep," Eleanor said, backing slowly away, her mind racing for some way to buy time. It was at that moment that the door at the base of the stairs banged open, and the Duke's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the tavern's noise below. "Barrett, step away from the door, and this need not become any more difficult than it already is." Barrett's face paled at the sound of the Duke's voice, his earlier confidence crumbling into something closer to panic. He glanced once more at Eleanor, weighing his options, before pushing past her roughly and attempting to flee down the back stairs. Mr. Ellery, who had been waiting precisely for such an attempt, caught him firmly by the arm at the bottom of the steps, holding him fast, despite his struggling protests. Eleanor emerged from the room moments later, shaken but unharmed, the recovered papers still clutched tightly in her hand. The Duke crossed the narrow hallway in a few quick strides, his eyes searching her face with visible concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "I am well," Eleanor said, though her hands trembled slightly as she held out the papers. "We have what we need, Your Grace. Everything." His handwriting, matching the letters sent to you, and a ledger recording payments from someone with the initials HV. The Duke took the papers carefully, scanning them with an expression that shifted from anger to grim satisfaction as the truth of Lord Vale's scheme became undeniable. "This is more than enough," he said quietly. "This is proof that will end his plans entirely and clear both our names in the process." Below them, Barrett continued to struggle weakly against Mr. Ellery's firm grip, already beginning to stammer excuses and accusations against Lord Vale, in a desperate attempt to save himself from the consequences of what he had done. Eleanor watched him for a moment, feeling not triumph, but a quiet, steady relief, the sense of a burden finally beginning to lift after days of uncertainty and fear. "Thank you," the Duke said quietly, turning back to her, "for your courage tonight. I do not know many people, of any station, who would have taken such a risk to defend the truth." "I could not simply wait for others to decide my fate for me," Eleanor said. "I have spent enough years doing that already." The Duke studied her for a long moment in the dim tavern light, something warm and unmistakable settling into his expression, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid of being seen. The following morning, word of Lord Vale's disgrace spread through the county, with the same speed the false rumors once had, though this time, the truth traveled ahead of any exaggeration. The Duke had wasted no time in presenting the recovered evidence to the local magistrate, along with Barrett's own confession, extracted after a long night of questioning, during which the dismissed footman proved far more willing to protect himself than to protect the man who had paid him. Lord Vale, confronted with the ledger bearing his own initials and the damning testimony of the man he had hired, offered little defense beyond a series of increasingly desperate denials that convinced no one. Within a day, his creditors, who had been watching his affairs closely for months, moved swiftly to reclaim what they were owed, and the young lord who had once courted Lydia with such confident charm found himself facing consequences far more severe than a broken engagement. At Ashworth House, the news arrived like a slow, unraveling storm. Lydia, who had spent the previous days convinced that Eleanor's actions alone had damaged her prospects, now found herself confronted with a truth far more difficult to accept. The man she had believed loved her had in fact been using her family's reputation and her own dowry as nothing more than a solution to his debts. Eleanor found her sister in the garden that afternoon, sitting alone on the same stone bench where Eleanor herself had so often sought quiet comfort over the years. Lydia's eyes were red, though her posture remained stiff and proud, as though she could not quite allow herself the full weight of tears. "I suppose you have heard everything," Lydia said without looking up as Eleanor approached. "I have," Eleanor said gently, sitting down beside her sister. "I am sorry, Lydia. Truly. Whatever has passed between us, I take no pleasure in seeing you hurt this way." Lydia laughed bitterly, though there was little humor in the sound. "You should take some pleasure in it. I have mocked you for years, told you that you would never marry, that you were an embarrassment to this family. And here I am, courted by a man who cared nothing for me at all, while you have caught the attention of the most respected duke in the county, without even trying." "I did not catch his attention by trying to outshine anyone," Eleanor said. "I simply stopped pretending to be smaller than I am. Perhaps that is something worth remembering, Lydia, regardless of what has happened with Lord Vale." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "I do not know how to stop competing," she admitted finally, her voice smaller than Eleanor had ever heard it. "Mother raised us to believe that our worth depended entirely on who noticed us, who wanted us, who chose us above other women. I have spent my whole life measuring myself against you and Charlotte, and I never once considered that the measuring itself might be the problem." "It is never too late to consider it," Eleanor said. "I spent years believing I had already lost, simply because I did not fit the shape everyone expected of me. I do not wish the same mistake upon you." For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, Lydia reached over and took her sister's hand, and the two of them sat together in silence, something old and long buried between them beginning, slowly and carefully, to mend. Inside the house, Lady Priscilla's reaction to the unfolding scandal proved far more complicated. She had spent days orchestrating strategies to secure the Duke's favor through Lydia, only to watch those plans collapse entirely, replaced by an outcome she had actively tried to prevent. When Eleanor found her in the drawing room later that evening, her mother's expression was unusually subdued, lacking its familiar sharp edges. "I owe you an apology," Lady Priscilla said, before Eleanor had even fully entered the room. The words seemed to cost her a great deal, each one delivered with visible effort. "I removed your name from that guest list because I believed your presence would diminish your sister's chances. I was wrong, Eleanor. Wrong about a great many things, it seems." Eleanor stood quietly for a moment, absorbing words she had waited her entire adult life to hear. "You have spent years treating me as though I were an obstacle to this family's success, Mother, rather than a part of it." "I know," Lady Priscilla said, her voice quieter than Eleanor had ever heard it. "I told myself I was protecting your sister's futures, but I see now that I was simply repeating patterns I learned from my own mother, who measured my worth the same way, comparing me endlessly to sisters and cousins, until I believed my only value lay in whom I could attract. I did not wish to pass that same burden on to you, and yet I did so regardless. I do not say this to punish you further," Eleanor said carefully, "but I have spent years feeling invisible in my own home. I would ask, going forward, that you see me as I am, rather than as a comparison to what my sisters might become." "I will try," Lady Priscilla said, and though the words were simple, something in her tone suggested she meant them more sincerely than she had meant anything in a very long time. Charlotte, who had listened to much of the exchange from the hallway, entered the room hesitantly, her earlier cruelty replaced by something closer to genuine remorse. "I am sorry as well, Eleanor," she said. "I followed Lydia's example without ever questioning whether it was right to do so. I see now how unkind we have both been." Eleanor looked at her two sisters and her mother, each of them offering, in their own imperfect way, an apology she had waited years to receive. She did not feel triumphant, exactly, nor did she feel the urge to punish them further for their past cruelty. She felt, instead, a quiet and unexpected sense of relief, as though a weight she had carried for so long she had forgotten its presence had finally begun to lift from her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply. "I would like, very much, for things to be different between us from now on. In the days that followed, news of Lord Vale's disgrace continued to occupy the county's attention, gradually replaced by fresh gossip, as new scandals inevitably arose to take its place. The Duke, meanwhile, called on Eleanor formally, his visits becoming a regular and welcome fixture at Ashworth House, no longer met with Lady Priscilla's calculated interference, but with a genuine, if still somewhat awkward, warmth. During one such visit, as the two of them walked together through the same garden where Eleanor had once sat alone beneath the apple tree, wondering what it might feel like to be truly seen, the Duke stopped and turned to face her, his expression more serious than she had seen it since the night at the tavern. "I have spent 3 years believing that the world would only ever see me through the lens of old grief and old suspicion," he said. "I did not expect, when I finally returned to society, to find someone capable of seeing past all of that so quickly, and so completely." "I did not expect it either," Eleanor admitted. "I had grown accustomed to believing I would spend my life unseen, valued only for the quiet tasks no one else wished to perform." "You are far more than that," the Duke said. "You are the bravest and most clear-sighted person I have ever known, Miss Ashworth, and I find that I have no wish to continue this acquaintance in half measures." Eleanor felt her heart quicken, though she said nothing, waiting to hear whatever he intended to say next, sensing that the quiet garden around them was about to become the setting for something neither of them would ever forget. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, taking her hand gently in his own. "Eleanor, I have known you only a short time, yet in that short time, you have shown me more honesty, more courage, and more genuine understanding than I have found in years of careful, guarded acquaintance with the rest of society. I do not offer this proposal lightly, nor do I offer it because it would be convenient or expected. I offer it because I cannot imagine continuing forward without you at my side." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as he lowered himself onto one knee before her, the late afternoon light filtering gently through the branches of the apple tree above them. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" he asked, "not as a duchess chosen for appearances or convenience, but as a woman I have come to admire and trust more deeply than I believed myself capable of trusting anyone again." For a long moment, Eleanor could not speak at all, the weight of the question settling over her like something both enormous and entirely natural, as though her whole life had been quietly preparing her for exactly this moment, without her ever realizing it. She thought of the years of quiet dismissal, the mocking laughter of her sisters, the cold calculations of her mother, and the countless nights she had told herself that such happiness was simply not meant for someone like her. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady and sure despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Yes, I will marry you, Alistair." The Duke rose and drew her gently into his arms, and for a moment, the garden around them seemed to hold its breath in quiet celebration of a match no one in the county had ever thought to predict. News of the engagement spread even faster than the scandal that had preceded it, and this time, the whispers carried nothing but admiration and surprise in equal measure. Lady Priscilla, informed of the proposal that same evening, sat in stunned silence for a long moment before rising to embrace her eldest daughter with a warmth Eleanor could not remember ever receiving from her before. "I could not be prouder," Lady Priscilla said, her voice thick with an emotion that seemed to surprise even herself. "Whatever mistakes I have made in raising you, Eleanor, you have proven far wiser and far stronger than I ever gave you credit for." Lydia and Charlotte offered their congratulations as well, their earlier jealousy replaced by something that, over the following weeks, grew into genuine happiness for their sister. Lydia, still recovering from the humiliation of Lord Vale's betrayal, found in Eleanor's engagement not a source of renewed competition, but an unexpected source of comfort, proof that kindness and patience could yield a happiness that scheming and vanity never had. The wedding, when it finally took place several months later, was a quiet and elegant affair, held not at the grand cathedral in town that Lady Priscilla had initially suggested, but in the small stone chapel near Ashworth House, surrounded only by close family and the few true friends Eleanor had gathered over the years. Helen stood proudly at her side throughout the ceremony, and even Mr. Foley, the loyal steward who had first brought her the wandering invitation that changed everything, was invited to witness the day he had unknowingly helped set into motion. Eleanor wore a simple gown of soft ivory, far less elaborate than the dresses her sisters had once competed over for the county ball, and yet she had never felt more beautiful in her life. As she walked down the short aisle toward the man waiting for her, she She caught sight of her father, standing a little straighter than usual, pride visible on his face for perhaps the first time in years, and her mother, dabbing quietly at her eyes with a handkerchief she had clearly not expected to need. The Duke, standing at the altar in his finest dark coat, watched her approach with an expression of such open affection that Eleanor felt any lingering doubt about her own worth dissolve entirely beneath its warmth. When she reached his side, he took her hand and leaned close enough to whisper words meant only for her. "You have made me believe in second chances," he said softly, "in every possible sense." "As you have done for me," Eleanor replied, and together they turned to face the small gathering of witnesses who had come to see the county's most unlikely match finally made whole. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of vows and quiet joy, and when the officiant finally pronounced them husband and wife, a small cheer rose from the gathered guests, led enthusiastically by Helen, and, somewhat to everyone's surprise, by Lydia herself, who clapped with a genuine, unreserved happiness that spoke to how far she had traveled from the bitter young woman she had once been. As the newly married couple emerged from the chapel into the bright afternoon sun, Eleanor paused for a moment to look back at the small crowd behind her, at the family who had once dismissed her so easily, now gathered to celebrate the very qualities they had spent years overlooking. She felt no bitterness toward them, no lingering need to prove herself further. She felt, instead, a quiet and complete sense of peace, the kind that comes only after a long and difficult journey has finally reached its rightful end. "Are you ready?" the Duke asked, offering his arm as their carriage waited nearby to carry them toward the beginning of their new life together. "I have been ready for a very long time," Eleanor said, smiling as she took his arm. "I simply needed someone willing to see it." Together, they stepped into the carriage, leaving behind the small stone chapel and the county that had once written her off as unremarkable, and rode forward into a future neither of them could have imagined only a few short months before, built not on appearances or calculation, but on honesty, courage, and the quiet, steady strength that had been Eleanor's greatest gift all along. A year passed quickly at Marchfield House, and the estate that had once stood quiet and closed to visitors slowly filled again with warmth and life. Eleanor took to her new role with the same steady attention she had once brought to her father's tangled ledgers, managing the household with quiet efficiency, while never losing the gentle observance that had first drawn the Duke to her side. Where Alistair had once been feared for his silence, the county now spoke of him differently, describing a man who laughed more freely, who welcomed guests into his home, and who credited his transformation openly and often to the wife who had refused to be frightened away by his reputation. The truth about Miss Vaughan's death, so long clouded by rumor and unspoken suspicion, finally found its proper resting place as well. During the investigation into Lord Vale and Barrett's scheme, an old physician who had attended Miss Vaughan in her final days came forward, prompted by news of the scandal, to confirm publicly what he had always known privately, that she had suffered from a sudden illness of the heart, entirely unconnected to any fault or neglect on the Duke's part. The confirmation arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it lifted a burden from Alistair's shoulders that Eleanor had watched him carry since the earliest days of their acquaintance. At Ashworth House, changes continued to unfold as well. Lydia, humbled by her experience with Lord Vale, spent the following months rebuilding her sense of self away from the constant competition that had once defined her, eventually finding genuine affection with a quiet gentleman farmer who valued her company for reasons that had nothing to do with dowries or appearances. Charlotte, freed from the shadow of her older sister's constant striving, discovered her own quiet talent for painting, filling the halls of Ashworth House with landscapes that revealed an eye for beauty no one in the family had ever thought to notice before. Lady Priscilla, though she never fully abandoned her instinct toward calculation and appearance, softened considerably in the years that followed, visiting Eleanor often at Marchfield House, and taking genuine, unguarded joy in the arrival of her first grandchild, a daughter born to Eleanor and Alistair the following spring. She held the child with a tenderness Eleanor had rarely witnessed in her mother during her own childhood, and Eleanor found, watching the two of them together, that old wounds could heal in unexpected ways, given enough time and enough willingness to try. Helen remained a constant and cherished friend throughout it all, visiting frequently, and never once allowing Eleanor to forget the quiet courage she had shown long before anyone else recognized it. It was Helen, in fact, who often reminded Eleanor of that very first evening. The letter fallen to the floor, the invitation delayed by chance to the wrong estate, and the extraordinary chain of small decisions that had led, eventually, to everything that followed. "Do you ever wonder," Helen asked one afternoon, as the two women sat together in the gardens of Marchfield House, watching Eleanor's young daughter chase butterflies across the lawn, "what might have happened if that invitation had never reached you at all?" Eleanor considered the question for a long moment, watching her daughter's delighted laughter carry across the warm afternoon air. "I have wondered," she admitted, "but I have come to believe that even without the invitation, I would have found my own way forward eventually. I had simply grown tired of waiting for someone else's permission to matter." "And Alistair? Do you believe you would have found each other regardless?" Eleanor smiled, glancing toward the house where her husband stood in the doorway, watching his small family with an expression of quiet, contented happiness that still, even after a year of marriage, occasionally caught her by surprise. "Perhaps not in quite the same way," she said, "but I believe two people who are willing to see each other honestly will always find a way to meet, sooner or later, however the world tries to arrange things otherwise." As the afternoon sun began to lower over Marchfield House, casting long golden light across the gardens, where Eleanor had once feared she would spend her whole life unnoticed, she felt nothing but gratitude for the winding, uncertain path that had brought her here. The county that had once mocked her as an unmarriageable spinster now spoke her name with respect and admiration, but Eleanor herself had long since stopped needing their approval to know her own worth. She had found it herself, quietly and patiently, long before anyone else had thought to look for it, and in doing so, she had discovered that the most feared man in the county had never truly frightened her at all. He had simply been the first person willing to see her exactly as she was, and to recognize, at last, that she had been remarkable all along.